I still remember the moment I sensed something was terribly off in our marriage. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-June, the sun lingering a bit longer in the sky, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass from the neighbors' lawns. I'd come home from work later than usual and found our house eerily silent. Normally, Claire would have some music playing in the background or be on the phone chatting with her sister. But that evening, I pushed open the door and heard only the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I called her name, my voice echoing down the hall, and she appeared around the corner with a start, as though she'd done something she wasn't supposed to. Her smile looked forced, her eyes darting away when I tried to meet them. It was subtle, just a flicker, but I knew her too well. After 7 years of marriage, you learn to read the smallest shifts in your partner's demeanor. I asked if everything was okay. She said yes, of course, just tired. I wanted to believe her, but there was something in her tone, clipped, hurried, that made my stomach tighten with unease. In the following days, the distance between us seemed to grow. She was perpetually on her phone, tapping away at messages she never shared, or stepping outside to take calls under the guise of wanting better reception. Normally, Claire was always excited to show me photos or funny videos her friends sent her. Lately, she guarded her phone like a dragon with its hoard. When I asked her about work, she gave vague answers, as if the details no longer mattered. Her job in product development used to inspire her. She'd spend dinner describing new prototypes and brainstorming marketing angles. Now, she offered nothing. Sometimes, she'd mention an upcoming project, trailing off mid-sentence as though she'd already lost interest. It was a stark contrast to the woman I married, bright-eyed, full of ideas, always fueling a conversation about something new she wanted to try. I tried to be patient, telling myself everyone goes through phases, that maybe she was stressed, or that an unknown personal worry gnawed at her. We'd promised to talk about everything, big or small. But each time I gently tried to coax out what might be bothering her, she shrugged or insisted nothing was wrong. I recall standing by the kitchen sink one night, rinsing dishes while she scrolled through her phone across the room. I asked if she wanted to watch a movie together. She glanced up, stifled a yawn, and said she was too tired. She wandered off to the bedroom, leaving me to watch the rest of my show alone. A small worry began to bloom at the back of my mind, but I tried to bury it with optimism. Maybe we just needed a little excitement, a date night out, or a weekend trip somewhere new. We'd done that in the past, whenever we felt the spark dimming under the weight of daily routine. But every time I suggested it, she'd offer a non-committal grunt, as if the idea of spending focused time with me only heightened her anxiety. As the weeks dragged on, the tension between us mounted like a static charge in the air. I started noticing odd inconsistencies in her stories. She'd say she was meeting her colleague, Alyssa, for a quick drink after work, only for Alyssa to casually mention over a future lunch that she and Claire hadn't hung out in months. Another time, Claire came home smelling of cologne that wasn't mine. It was faint, but once you catch a single whiff, you can't unsmell it. I asked where she'd been, and she mumbled something about a crowded elevator in her office building. When I pressed for more details, she snapped at me to stop interrogating her. It was the first time I'd seen that mix of anger and fear in her eyes, and it chilled me. The warmth that once characterized our relationship was fading fast, replaced by mistrust and frustration. My own anxiety spiked. I wasn't the jealous type, never had been, but the mounting evidence, her guarded phone, the unexplained outings, the lies, was impossible to ignore. One evening, I got home to find her sitting in the living room, flipping through a glossy magazine, wearing the exact same outfit she'd left in that morning. She hadn't even taken off her shoes. When she saw me, she jumped up with a forced smile and asked about my day. I stood there, studying her stiff posture, the slight tremble in her voice, realizing I didn't recognize this version of Claire. She noticed my expression and tried to close the distance with a quick embrace, but I froze. I demanded to know what was going on, why she'd been acting strange for months. She tried to pivot, claiming she was just in a funk and that work was draining her. Something about the way her gaze slipped away made me realize she was lying. I felt my heart in my throat. All I could manage to say was, "I need you to be honest with me." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, but refused to elaborate. Instead, she brushed past me, saying she wanted to shower, leaving me in the living room, emotions swirling. I confided in one of my closest friends, Mark, about my suspicions. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning, and I recounted everything: the strange calls, the lying about small details, the cologne scent. Mark listened intently, asking questions, and I could see a grim understanding in his eyes. He suggested that maybe she was having an affair. The word sent a jolt through me, even though I'd suspected as much. Saying it aloud made it real. I shook my head, hoping to dismiss the notion, but deep down, the pit in my stomach told me Mark was probably right. Still, I wasn't ready to accuse her without solid proof. Mark, ever practical, recommended I do some discreet investigating, check phone records, look at credit card statements, maybe even follow her if I had to. It felt invasive, like breaching an unspoken trust, but we'd already reached that point, hadn't we? That night, I waited until Claire was asleep. I slipped out of bed and crept to the living room, her phone in hand. She always kept it locked, but I'd seen her enter the passcode enough times to guess it. My fingers shook as I typed in those digits, and my breath caught when the screen unlocked, revealing her home screen. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself to be quick, to just see if there were messages or calls that might confirm or deny my worst fears. I opened her messaging app, scrolling through names. Most were friends I recognized, but one in particular stood out: Travis, someone I didn't know. Their conversation thread was pinned at the top. With a trembling thumb, I tapped it. My jaw clenched as I read their messages. Their tone was playful, flirtatious, sprinkled with inside jokes. The timestamps indicated they'd been talking late at night, especially on the evening she claimed to be working overtime or out with a friend. The conversation referenced lunches, visits to his place, movie nights. My blood ran cold when I saw an exchange from just 2 days prior. Claire described how bored she felt at home lately, how Travis made her feel alive again. The man responded with lines of admiration, praising how adventurous she was compared to others. They hinted at physical intimacy, referencing incidents that made my stomach turn. My mind whirled, reading proof that everything I suspected was true. She was cheating on me with a man who apparently offered the thrill she claimed our marriage lacked. I set the phone down, heart pounding with a mix of rage and heartbreak. I felt nauseous, as if the floor had dropped out from under me. For a moment, I considered waking her up and confronting her right then and there, but my anger and disbelief needed time to settle. I returned the phone to where it had been charging, then slipped back into bed, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I hardly slept, 1,000 questions ping-ponging in my head. How long had this been going on? Why didn't she talk to me if she was bored or unhappy? Did our marriage mean so little to her that she'd just roam into someone else's arms without a second thought? The next day, I decided to keep my discovery to myself, at least for the moment. I needed a plan, a way to confront her that wouldn't degenerate into pointless shouting, a method to make her feel the shock, the betrayal, the sting of her actions. We'd built our life together, shared finances, a cozy home, plans for children someday. Knowing she'd trampled on all that for a fling fueled my need not just for answers, but for a reckoning. I thought of everything we'd been through: vacations, birthdays, quiet nights reading on the couch. All of it overshadowed now by her confessions to Travis about how dull our life had become. The word battered my mind: dull. She called it boredom. As if our bond, our love, was just an old toy she could toss aside for a shinier one. I withdrew emotionally, playing the part of the clueless husband for a week while I mustered the nerve to set my plan in motion. She noticed I was quieter and tried to be extra sweet, perhaps sensing something was amiss. Once or twice, she asked if I was angry with her, but I brushed it off, giving half smiles and murmuring that I was just busy at work. Meanwhile, I gathered the evidence I needed. I took screenshots of her messages, emailed them to myself, made copies of financial documents. I even managed to confirm Travis's address from a conversation thread about him inviting her over for a Friday night date. It took every ounce of self-control not to slam the phone on the ground when I read her giddy acceptance. Friday arrived. Claire claimed she had a team-building dinner after work and would probably be home late. My chest burned with barely contained anger. Still, I played along, kissing her cheek goodbye as she left, a fake yawn on my lips to hide the turmoil behind my eyes. The moment she walked out, I called Mark. He agreed to come with me, to keep me from doing anything rash. We drove in his car, following the route to Travis's home, an apartment building on the other side of town. My heart pounded so fiercely that I gripped the door handle until my knuckles ached. We parked across the street, waiting in tense silence until Claire's car finally arrived. She stepped out, wearing a chic outfit I hadn't seen before, something that highlighted her figure in a way she hadn't done for me in ages. My blood simmered. Mark glanced over, eyes sympathetic, but said nothing. We watched her disappear into the building. After a few minutes, I told him we should give them time, let them settle. It was a twisted logic. I wanted to catch them mid-lie, with no escape. About half an hour later, we eased out of the car and crossed the street. My mouth felt dry, every nerve on edge as we found our way to Travis's door, guided by the apartment number I'd gleaned from some of their messages referencing his place. Once we stood in front of it, I hesitated, my heart roaring in my ears. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low. "You can turn around if you want," he said gently. But I shook my head, jaw set. I had to see it, had to confront the truth directly. I knocked. The sound felt deafening in the hallway. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faint footsteps approached. The door opened a sliver, revealing a man with tousled hair, wearing a casual t-shirt. He looked at me, puzzled. In the background, I saw a glimpse of the living room, and my eyes locked onto Claire, perched on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. She sprang to her feet, the blood draining from her face when she recognized me. Travis stammered, "Can I help you?" as if confused. I realized he had no idea who I was. My chest tightened with fury. "I'm her husband," I snarled, nodding toward Claire. His eyes widened in shock, and he stepped back. Claire rushed over, mumbling, "Wait, I can explain," but the sight of her, flustered, wine in hand in another man's apartment, was all the confirmation I needed. Mark hung back in the hallway, letting me handle the confrontation. My voice shook as I demanded, "Explain. You said you were going to a work dinner. Does this look like a work dinner?" She clasped her hands, tears forming in her eyes, her breath ragged. "It's not, look, it's not what you think," she tried, but her voice died under my furious stare. I turned to Travis, asking if he knew she was married, that she was lying to me every chance she got. He swallowed hard, admitted that yes, he knew, but he didn't think it was a big deal because Claire had told him our marriage was on the rocks, that we were practically separated. The gall of it made my vision blur with rage. I wanted to shout, to break something, but I inhaled sharply and forced my voice to remain steady. Claire started crying, stammering that she could explain everything, that it was just a fling, a momentary distraction. My heart twisted painfully. Seeing her with tears in her eyes might have once elicited comfort, but now it only fueled my anger. I told her to get her things. She sniffled, pointing to a small purse and some files she'd evidently brought as her cover story. Travis stood there, awkward, clearly reeling. I confronted him directly, "You had no right messing with another man's wife. You hear me?" He raised his hands defensively, apologizing, saying he didn't think we had a real marriage left. I nearly lost my temper, but Mark finally stepped in, placing a hand on my shoulder again, urging me to keep calm. Claire followed me outside, trembling, tears staining her cheeks. The hallway felt claustrophobic, so we went to the parking lot. She kept trying to speak, but I cut her off each time. Finally, she burst out in a desperate explanation. I was bored, okay? I felt suffocated in our routine. I didn't know how to talk to you about it. Then I met Travis, and everything felt exciting again. I stared at her in disbelief. Bored. That single word hammered through my mind, echoing all the nights we'd spent building a life together. She was bored, so she decided to shatter my trust. Fury simmered, but I forced it down. Instead, I told her I wanted her out of our home, that her things would be packed, and she should find somewhere else to stay. She sobbed, trying to grab my hand, but I yanked it away. The cold finality in my voice must have frightened her. She kept pleading, "Wait, let's talk, we can fix this," but I was done listening. I left her there in that parking lot with Mark trailing behind me, the heaviness in the air nearly suffocating. The ride back was silent except for Mark occasionally asking if I was okay. I wasn't sure how to answer that. I felt shattered, angry, betrayed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they cramped. She'd said she was just bored. As if betrayal was an acceptable remedy for boredom. The word stung more than I anticipated, a reminder that she saw our life as some stale thing that could be easily replaced by a fling. I realized that I couldn't just let her slip back into my home, offering half-hearted apologies. She had to face consequences, to feel the shock of losing everything she'd taken for granted. I'd played the role of the stable, reliable husband, never once doubting her loyalty, while she toyed with a stranger because she craved excitement. That night, I barely slept. I typed a long message to her, telling her not to come home. I demanded that she find a place to stay, perhaps at a friend's or at her parents'. I didn't care. The next day, she showed up anyway, puffy-eyed, claiming she had nowhere else to go, that she'd made a mistake. I refused to open the door. She stood on the porch, voice cracking as she begged me to let her explain. But the image of her on Travis's couch, wine in hand, was burned into my memory. I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me, and told her that if she truly wanted a chance to fix this, she needed to give me space. She kept repeating that she was sorry, that it was a lapse in judgment. Her voice trembled when she admitted she never meant for it to go this far. She insisted Travis was nothing, that she was only looking for excitement. My stomach churned at the casual way she framed her betrayal, as though it was a fleeting pastime. I let her gather some clothes and essentials, eyes tearing up when she realized I'd already started boxing her belongings. She tried to say I was overreacting, which sparked a brief argument. Overreacting? She'd crushed my trust underfoot, and yet I was supposed to remain calm and reasonable. I told her she was lucky I didn't throw her things onto the lawn. With trembling hands, she carried out a couple of suitcases, crying softly. A twisted sense of satisfaction gnawed at me, seeing her so undone. But behind my anger lay profound sadness. I'd loved this woman enough to share my life with her, and now we stood on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal. After she left, I locked the door, leaning against it with a ragged sigh. Our home felt hollow, as if her presence had drained the warmth from it, leaving only the echoes of shattered illusions. In the days that followed, she texted me constantly. Messages ranged from apologetic pleas to angry accusations that I was throwing everything away. At times, she argued that it was just a mistake, that she only cheated a few times. Other messages pivoted to sorrow, claiming she'd do anything to regain my trust. The emotional whiplash made my head spin. I responded only once, telling her that I was done with half measures. If she truly wanted a chance at reconciliation, she needed to cooperate on my terms. Full honesty, no contact with Travis, and a willingness to accept that our marriage might not survive. She said she agreed, that she'd delete his number immediately, that she was ready to meet any conditions. But I wasn't naive. Words were cheap. She'd lied so effortlessly before, so I demanded more than a simple vow. I told her if she was serious, she had to let me see her phone, her emails, everything, whenever I asked. She reluctantly agreed. We arranged a meeting at a neutral spot, Mark's apartment, where he'd let me use his place for privacy. She arrived looking worn, eyes rimmed with dark circles. She tried to hug me the moment she walked in, but I held up a hand. I wanted to talk first. She sank into a chair, fiddling with her fingers while I sat across from her. I told her I needed the truth. How long had this been happening? She admitted it started about 6 months ago. My stomach dropped at the length of time. 6 months of stolen kisses, secret calls, all while I thought we were just drifting through a rough patch. She said it began innocently, that Travis was a friend from a gym she started going to, and they bonded over shared interests. Eventually, it escalated to private meetups for drinks, then nights at his place. She apologized 1,000 times, blaming her restlessness, her desire for a thrill, claiming she never intended to actually hurt me. The phrase, "I was bored," slipped from her lips again, as though that was somehow an explanation that would garner sympathy. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to lash out. Instead, I told her we had 2 options, either we ended this marriage, or we tried therapy, complete transparency, and radical honesty. I made it clear that even with therapy and honesty, there was no guarantee I'd forgive her or want to stay. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, saying she'd do anything not to lose me, that she realized too late how much she valued our life together. It was an oddly gratifying moment, seeing her so desperate, after I'd spent weeks feeling powerless in the face of her deceit. I told her to leave me alone for a while so I could think. She left quietly, glancing back at me as though hoping for a sign of mercy. I kept my face impassive. Time stretched on, and I wrestled with my emotions. A part of me yearned to let her back in, to remember the good times and hope we could rebuild. Another part couldn't stomach the idea of being with someone who'd so casually stepped out, labeling her wrongdoing as the result of boredom. That word kept haunting me, replaying in my mind each time I recalled the look on her face. Bored. As though our life, our love, was some stale routine she needed to spice up behind my back. I confided in Mark again, and he reminded me that if I took her back, I needed to do it with eyes wide open, not out of pity or fear of being alone. His advice resonated. I realized that my next move needed to be decisive, for my own peace of mind. If she was truly remorseful, I wanted her to face the reality of losing me. She needed to see that her flippant choice had harsh consequences. So I decided on something bold. Through a mutual friend, I arranged a gathering at our house, inviting a handful of people who knew us both, friends, some relatives, not a huge crowd, but enough to put her on the spot. Claire had been staying at her sister's place, so I contacted her and told her we should talk at the house on Saturday afternoon. She agreed, probably believing it was just me. When she arrived, she found a small group assembled, all wearing concerned or curious expressions. She froze in the doorway, eyes darting around. I stood in the center of the living room, arms crossed, my face set. She whispered, "What is this?" I told her calmly it was time to be honest, truly honest, about why our marriage was on the brink. The hush in the room felt electric. She glanced at the faces of our friends, some close, some mere acquaintances, but all aware something was deeply wrong. She tried to stutter a protest, tears welling up, but I insisted. "You claim you want to fix this. Then prove it. Tell them what you did." Her cheeks blazed with shame. One of our friends stepped forward gently, asking if this was the best way. I shook my head, explaining that Claire had spent months lying to everyone, not just me. She'd made them complicit in her deception whenever she claimed we were fine, leading me to suspect I was the problem. Now, I wanted her to face them and own her betrayal. She gulped, tears rolling down her cheeks. In a trembling voice, she admitted she had an affair, that she lied to me for months, that she disrespected our marriage. The shock on some of their faces was palpable, especially those who always saw Claire as the sweet, loyal wife. She tried to justify it, saying she felt stuck, that she'd lost herself. But it didn't lessen the stunned silence. Finally, she sobbed, "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt him. I was just bored." The second the words left her lips, I saw a few onlookers cringe. My friend Mark shook his head in disbelief. One of Claire's close friends even burst into tears, asking how she could do that. Claire stood there, shoulders slumped, humiliated. It was a harsh scene, and a part of me felt almost cruel for orchestrating it, but I couldn't help remembering how I felt the night I discovered her texts, my own humiliation, confusion, and heartbreak. Now, she was the one on display, forced to confront the reality of her actions. When the tension peaked, I told her calmly, "You wanted excitement. Well, here's the shock of your life. You can't just waltz back in and expect me to treat this like a minor mistake. You shattered my trust. And now everyone knows exactly why." She broke down, sobbing in front of everyone. I felt a pang of guilt, but also a twisted sense of vindication. If she thought her boredom was reason enough to cheat, maybe publicly airing the consequences would make her understand how serious it was. A few friends comforted her, though many stood stiffly, unsure how to react. The silence was thick. Eventually, she whispered, "I'll do anything to fix this." I responded that we'd consider counseling, and if I decided to give her another chance, she had to accept that it might take years, if ever, for me to trust her again. The room was tense, the emotional weight suffocating. Some friends looked at me with concern, as if to say, "Are you sure this is the right approach?" But no one spoke up to defend her. They'd seen her confession, they understood I was the wronged party, and if I needed this moment to find closure, they weren't going to stop me. Claire's tears flowed freely. She tried to cling to my arm, but I stepped back, telling her she would have to leave the house again after we ended this meeting. We would schedule counseling sessions if she still wanted to pursue that path. But for now, I couldn't bear to share the same space with her. She eventually left, face streaked with tears, avoiding eye contact with the onlookers. A few followed her out, presumably to make sure she was okay. In the aftermath, I stood there, feeling both drained and grimly satisfied. Mark patted my back, asking if I felt better. I said I wasn't sure. Part of me felt like I'd stooped to a dramatic, almost vengeful tactic, but another part felt an odd sense of release. By refusing to hide what she did, I forced her to confront the magnitude of her betrayal. Everyone who cared about us now knew the truth, and I no longer had to shoulder the burden of her secrets alone. In the days that followed, some people criticized my approach as too harsh, while others told me I had every right. I wrestled with guilt, replaying the scene of her sobbing confession in my mind. But each time I felt remorse, I remembered the months of lies, the way she'd stolen my peace and dismissed our marriage as some stale routine. If she truly wanted a second chance, she had to understand the depth of the hurt she caused. And, ironically, the next step was therapy, which we both begrudgingly started. We sat in a counselor's office, tension thick as we recounted how we met, how our relationship once sparkled with joy, how it eroded under the weight of unspoken frustrations. Claire admitted she chose the cowardly path, seeking distraction instead of telling me she was unhappy. She cried, telling the counselor she hated herself for it now. I listened, arms folded, occasionally interjecting with bitterness about her boredom rationale. The counselor tried to help us untangle the emotional threads, but trust was the biggest hurdle. I told Claire I couldn't imagine trusting her anytime soon. She nodded, as if resigned to the fact. But she pledged to do whatever it took, quit her job if that helped, avoid the gym where she met Travis, cut off all ties with any mutual friends they had. She even offered to share all her passwords, a phone tracking app, anything I needed. It was a gesture of desperation, maybe sincerity. I told her I'd think about it. The counselor reminded us that healing wouldn't be linear, that we might have setbacks, outbursts, or relapses of anger. I was grateful for that honesty, because a part of me was already tired of the entire process, unsure if I even wanted to continue with her. Nonetheless, I persisted with therapy, mostly to see if my feelings could shift from raw fury to a place of acceptance. Over time, I felt slight pangs of empathy for her confusion, her sense of being unfulfilled. But I never excused her actions. If boredom was the problem, there were 100 healthier ways to address it. The memory of her betrayal lingered, flaring up whenever she got a text message or came home a bit later than usual. Sometimes, I'd lash out verbally, accusing her of lying. She'd break down in tears, insisting she was telling the truth, that she'd never cheat again. My skepticism remained, the phantom of betrayal haunting me at odd moments. After several months of counseling, we reached a crossroads. The therapist suggested we either commit fully to rebuilding the marriage or part ways, as lingering in this limbo would only breed more resentment. Claire looked at me, eyes brimming with tears, saying she wanted a fresh start, that she was ready to do anything for it. She'd already switched jobs to avoid any chance of crossing paths with Travis. She'd moved back into our home only after I said I was okay with it, sleeping in the guest room initially. Gradually, she tried to prove her trustworthiness through consistent honesty. I saw how it pained her each time I doubted a small detail, but she never lashed out, always apologizing for the wedge she'd created between us. At that point, I had to make a decision. Part of me felt it would be easier to walk away, to let her remain a memory of heartbreak. Another part acknowledged the years we'd shared, the dreams we once nurtured together. The counselor urged us to find a definitive path, so I proposed a trial period, a few more months of living under the same roof, continuing therapy, and seeing if any spark of genuine love remained. Claire agreed, relief washing over her face. She promised to abide by any rules I set for transparency. So we set boundaries. She gave me full access to her phone, her emails, her social media, and she agreed to check in frequently if she was going somewhere. It felt extreme, almost like policing her, but I wasn't ready to trust her otherwise. Living together under these circumstances was tense. We tiptoed around each other. She tried cooking favorite meals, suggesting small activities like we used to do, but a shadow always loomed. Sometimes I'd find myself laughing with her, momentarily forgetting the betrayal, only to remember it minutes later, the bitterness rushing back. She never complained, only apologized when I snapped. Slowly, though, I noticed small changes, her willingness to communicate about her day, the grateful look in her eyes when I chose to spend time with her. The final shock she experienced, the public humiliation of confessing her affair in front of friends, had, in a twisted sense, opened her eyes. She realized how deeply she'd disrespected not just me, but the people who cared about us. Over time, she rebuilt those friendships too, apologizing individually. 6 months passed. The therapy sessions continued, focusing on rebuilding intimacy and trust. I saw that she was genuinely remorseful, going above and beyond to show her commitment. I, on the other hand, wrestled with nightmares of her in that man's arms, of the nights I believed her lies. There were moments I doubted we could ever truly mend. But then there'd be an afternoon when she'd surprise me with a small gesture, like arranging a birthday scavenger hunt around the house, an echo of the playful side of her I fell in love with years ago. In those fleeting moments, I saw glimpses of hope. Eventually, I concluded that while I'd never forget her betrayal, I might learn to forgive it if she proved her loyalty every single day. She understood that regaining my trust was a lifelong process, that one slip-up would be enough for me to walk away forever. We sat down and wrote out our shared goals, from traveling to starting a family, tentatively discussing how we might handle major decisions moving forward. Though I still harbored doubts, I noticed a shift in my feelings. I wanted to see if we could defy the odds, transform this heartbreak into a cautionary tale that reminded us never to let our relationship stagnate again. When I think back to the moment she said, "I was just bored," I still feel that flash of anger. But I also recall the day she stood in our living room, tears streaming down her face, confessing her betrayal in front of people who believed in us. That day, I gave her the shock of her life, forcing her to confront the gravity of her actions. The memory of that scene, though painful, stands as a turning point, a violent jolt that uprooted her complacency and shattered any illusions that infidelity could be brushed aside as a minor lapse. If there's a reason our marriage eventually found a path toward fragile healing, it might be because I refused to let her hide behind empty excuses. It's not a story with a neat, perfect ending. Even now, years later, there are moments when I wonder if she ever misses the thrill she found elsewhere, if she ever wonders what might have happened had I not discovered her affair. We've had deep conversations about it, and she swears her only regret is that she inflicted pain on both of us for something so fleeting. She says she's no longer bored, that she learned it's up to both of us to keep our marriage alive, to communicate our needs before resentment festers. I try to believe her, because a relationship can't survive without trust, but the scars remain a reminder of what we went through. Despite everything, I can say we did manage to salvage something that resembles a marriage from the wreckage. It's not the same innocent love we once had, but a more cautious, deliberate commitment. We both faced harsh truths, her capacity to hurt me in pursuit of excitement, and my capacity to orchestrate a dramatic public confrontation. Maybe both of us discovered sides of ourselves we never wanted to see. Yet, from that dark place, we began to build a different foundation, one that acknowledges our flaws and vulnerabilities. Some days, the weight of betrayal still stings, but on others, I feel a quiet sense of pride that we didn't let a single word, bored, destroy us outright. We confronted it head-on, faced the shockwaves, and remained standing. In the end, I wouldn't label our story as triumphant or tragic, it exists somewhere in the messy middle. She said she was bored, I gave her a reality check that rocked her to her core, and we crawled back from the brink, battered but still together. Perhaps that's the hardest part to accept, that love can endure even after such devastation, if both parties are willing to endure the grueling process of rebuilding. Whether our marriage will last another decade, or if we'll eventually find it too painful to continue, remains an open question. But for now, I look at the woman who once shattered my heart and see someone who's fighting daily to earn back the trust she so carelessly discarded. And in turn, I fight to open my heart to her again. It's a fragile dance, one we perform without illusions, guided only by the hope that honesty and effort can sometimes overcome even the most jarring betrayal.